All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You're listening to the Currency of Discourse podcast with myself and Quaid. And maybe this will end up being a bit of a continuation from the last podcast we did talking about the American myth. But Quaid came across a quote that we thought might be worth having a discussion about regarding, patriotism and what it means to be a human being, in relation to maybe your nation and the world. And so I'm going to read it to you, and then I'm going to pass it off to Quaid, and we'll kind of see where this conversation takes us. I think, where'd you find it? You found it on like a humanist?
Yeah, I think it's
webpage?
like Humanists United or something, or United Humanists.
Okay. All right, well, here's the quote. So these are not my words or Quaid's, and we'll see how we feel about it as we go down this road. So here's the quote. I consider myself to be a human being first and an American second. As such, I place humanity over country. And if that makes me less patriotic, it makes patriots less human. So it's a pretty forward quote. And I mean, I think you can kind of tell where the author's standing his ground. But so what are your thoughts on that?
I thought that this quote could be a good jumping off point for some of the things we were talking about last time. So that's one thing, or that's kind of one reason for bringing it up. There seems to be some type of like internal logic for me. So it's a conditional, right? If then, right? So we're talking about a conditional. It's not saying that this is the way things are. It's saying if this is the way things are, then they're also this way. Mm-hmm. If it works this way, then it works this way. So you might view this person as having a definitive stance about which one's more important, which I see why you would pull that out, right? It seems to be there. But being a conditional, it also doesn't have to. He could be saying that they're equal, but if this is true, then this has to be true as well, even though I happen to believe that they're equal. Do you see the difference?
You happen to believe that they're equal.
No, I'm talking about this author. This author might view patriotism and humanism as equal or as concomitant or not mutually exclusive, right? Not things that you pit against each other or favor one over the other, right? Mm-hmm. But it would still, what they're saying would still be true because it's a conditional. It's under the condition that. So it's not, these are the way things are. It's, if it's this way, then it should be this way. So like, I know I'm at this point repeating myself, so I'll just go ahead and
I would explicit. Say it seems to me that he does believe that that's the case.
Right. And like I said, I can see why you can pull that out. But my point is that you don't have to take it that way. Right. Mm-hmm. I kind of gravitated towards the quote for its logical implications, which seem to be sound. So if you are saying it's wrong to be more patriotic than humanist, so to value your patriotism in your country more than humanity as a whole, and if you're saying that to privilege your humanity above your patriotism makes you less patriotic, right? And that's the whole point, right? Mm-hmm. Then you can also say that privileging your patriotism over your humanism, so being more prideful about where you come from rather than the fact that you're a human and humanity as a whole, right? Then it's also true to say that would make you less humanist, because you're saying the same thing about people who are less, or who favor humanism over patriotism. Mm-hmm. That's its point. So you can take it. You can take that statement. It makes perfect sense to also take that statement as, I'm not saying that you should be more humanist than patriotic. Maybe they're equal. But if you're going to say that to privilege humanism over patriotism makes you less of a patriot, then you can also say the reverse.
So this is from a humanistic...
It is. Yeah, I mean, obviously...
standpoint.
Right, it is a humanist... It's still from a humanist website. So, I mean, chances are that there's still a strong possibility that this person privileges their own humanity over their patriotism, right?
And probably other other individuals' humanity as well, obviously.
Right. But the point is that you don't have to take it that way. It is a conditional.
Mm-hmm.
It works under the premise that. So I think the point is, if you're going to point fingers at people and say, you're not a patriot because you sometimes side with the whole of humanity rather than your country, then I can also say, well, then you're less humanist because you sometimes favor your country over humans.
Mm.
It works in reverse. If it works one way, it works the other. You see what I'm saying? So it's just
Yeah.
like those people can't be too judgmental of each other, because you definitely don't want to not care about humans or be a humanist, right?
Sure.
So that was kind of my point. I'm not saying that, like, you shouldn't have pride in where you come from, but that is something certainly to think about and consider. It's logically coherent. It has a logical consistency that it's just trying to point out, even though it's a conditional, so it doesn't necessarily work in reality.
Mm-hmm.
That might not be what's going on here. So now we can talk about whether or not that is what's going on here and what we think, right?
Yeah.
Which I don't know. I don't know that I'm concerned with coming up with an answer once again. I think that it's the same as what I've said before. I think that this nation has the potential to do great things under certain conditions. But I also see myself as a human, and I am, at the end of the day, I'm out for humanity. I want humanity to survive and thrive as a whole,
Sure.
not just my nation.
Yeah, and I think we've stated, plenty of times on this podcast at this point that we're not out for giving answers. We might express our own opinions, but the objective is to get people to think about things in a reasonable way and not take some extremist viewpoint or we want people to be informed. But for me, looking at this quote, my opinion kind of stems off practicality. I would say. Of course, we're all human beings first, and that's how I see myself. But from a standpoint of practicality, because when I look at this quote, I see implications of like a pushback against nationalism, or like this mentality of America first, right? And for me, I'm not saying that I would put an American life, or I would give higher value to an American life over the life of someone in a completely different part of the world. From a practicality standpoint, you structure your society towards those who are closest to you. So you start with your family, having your house in order, then your community, your nearby community, your state, and then at a national level. That gives you culture identity. It tells you, it gives you indications on how society should be shaped and ruled, and those kinds of things. And you have more control over that based off of where you are, and like having a sense of control over that, I guess. And I lost my train of thought.
So I see what you're saying, and I agree. And I was thinking, like, I thought a few things about this as well. So one is that, and this is just a maybe, I'm not saying this is the way it should be, but possibly one of the thoughts that occurred to me was that you should act patriotically, but think humanistically. Mm-hmm. So, because you have to act at the local level, right? So act patriotically. So patriotism is an action. It's not a philosophy, whereas humanism is a philosophy. I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but that's something to consider, right? And the other things would be like, you still might be thinking patriotically in terms of you might. So the right thing to do. So again, I don't know if they're I don't know if they're mutually exclusive or if you have to favor one or the other. I'm not sure. I don't know. But some other things to think about and consider is maybe you see your nation as you see some of the components of the zeitgeist or the kind of like moral constituents and beliefs and values of your nation, and you think that those are what boosts humanity, right? So you think those are those are innately humanist, like those are both humanist, and I am patriotic by supporting them. I'm patriotic by supporting the fact that my nation seems to have produced a lot of these ideas, and I live here, and this is like, you have to act within that structure. Patriotism is acting favorably within the structure of the, not necessarily government, but possibly government and or society or zeitgeist of your culture.
Well, our country itself was founded by people who, followed humanistic principles.
Are considered humanists, in some circles, for sure.
And that's certainly shaped the way our country is like developed.
Yeah.
So for us being American, there are humanistic tendencies kind of embedded in our culture in conjunction with, probably Christian values as well. So there's like a mix between the two.
Yeah, I do want to specify though there, my 2 cents on that is also going to be that I see the American culture as an amalgamation of way more than just any one or a couple philosophies. I think it's layered, kind of, what's the word? It's layered. It's almost ridiculous to put too much emphasis on any one thing, because it is such an amalgamation of so many largely different aspects. So like Greek culture has influenced us. Western culture has influenced us. British culture has influenced us. Like, those are all different layers, right? And Christianity is just one layer of that, right? We've been influenced by a lot of different schools of thought, a lot of philosophies. Modern science. Modern science is a huge aspect of Western culture, right? Humanism, actually, to some extent. Humanism actually ends up transcending, Eastern and Western cultures. They both have aspects of humanism and have some relationship or association with the word, which is also really interesting and kind of conjures up a question that I'm going to ask you here in a second. But those are just some initial thoughts on that.
What's the question you want to ask?
So I'm just kind of curious as to, so if you had to choose, and does this answer the question or does this not answer the question, and why? If you had to choose between destroying all of humanity, but preserving your nation, right? Preserving your culture and nation, or destroying your culture and nation and preserving all of humanity, the rest of humanity, which one would you choose?
If I had to choose between destroying all of humanity
and preserving your nation,
my culture,
right? So your culture and nation would be the only one left.
My culture and nation destroyed and preserving the rest of humanity,
right? Like you would sacrifice your nation for the rest of humanity, or would you sacrifice humanity for your nation?
It's a really heavy question.
And does that, answer the question? Because if you end up saying one over the other, then you are that person that thinks that humanism, you're a humanist first, patriotic second, or vice versa. Patriot first. And let's also keep in mind, like, this is also just to clarify this thought experiment. Your nation isn't going to suffer at the loss of all the other nations, so it will remain mostly the same.
Am I destroying people or just
people,
the nation? So
no, people.
I mean, I don't really like, that's a crazy question to me, because that means I have to kill like
a lot of people, no matter what.
And then I have to make a value judgment based on that answer, which, I guess I don't like the premise of the question.
Okay, I mean,
like how it was laid out, but
okay.
Because I either have to say that my culture has some type of benefit over everybody else, or or the other collection of all the other cultures in the world get to survive at the expense of mine.
That all of it is more important than your one nation. That's what you're saying. That all of it is more important than your one nation, or your one nation is more important than the rest of it.
So it becomes some of the questions that come out of that question become
because what Hitler's answer would be too. I mean, or what certain historical figures' answers would be, not just Hitler, but realistically what their answers would be, right?
Yeah, maybe. But you have to ask. So you could either make it a numbers game and just make it something as simple as like, do I just want to save as many people as possible, and just swallow your pride, or you want to start asking questions about who's contributed more society and who's going to actually like do better for human beings in the long run.
Yeah.
But
it's all going to come down to a question of value. Like, which one do you think is more valuable?
Yeah, but you could, from a question of who can do more for humanity in the world, you can.
But if the rest of the world's gone, then you can't do anything for the rest of that world anymore, right? I'm just talking about in terms of the condition or the scenario that I'm conjuring up.
Sure, but you can continue to do more for humans that are still around.
Sure.
Yeah. And if, one part of the world is, I don't know. I'm not going to answer that. That's just like, I don't know.
And you could think about what Thanos' answer would be. I mean,
I don't know who Thanos is.
He's from Marvel.
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know who that is.
He's willing to sacrifice half of everybody for the rest of the half because he thinks they'll flourish, the other half. I still think it's an interesting question. I think.
Do you have an answer?
I would probably sacrifice the nation. Yeah, I probably would. So, I don't think that there's anything that America has picked up on that other nations can't pick up on or do.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think America's that special. That's just me.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes me less patriotic or what, but and then this is again under the condition that you forced me to make a choice. Like some maniacal mastermind has found a way to either completely rid the world of the nation or the rest of the world without really hurting. Because the reality is that you couldn't do it, right? The reality is you couldn't just remove a nation without, you couldn't remove a nation like America or like North America or the USA without it having real consequences on the rest of the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And you also couldn't remove the rest of humanity without damaging the U.S. as well. If you probably removing one or the other is going to disrupt whatever is left, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm kind of barring that exception because I understand that's the way things are. And so you can look at that and say, well, I don't really have to choose because to remove one is to remove the other, that you kind of need both, right? But just in terms of accepting this hypothetical scenario, which would never actually happen, right? So it is, in every extent, hypothetical. We're probably never going to have that option, right? Then I would say, yes, I would remove the one nation over the rest of humanity. Because in terms of population, in terms of the amount of culture, right? Like you'll still have bits of American culture preserved in other cultures. Whereas if you remove the rest of them, you're probably going to lose a lot of cultures with a lot of different ideas. So I feel like you would lose less culture if you got rid of America, even though you might lose very important aspects of what the American culture brings to the table. So, I mean, that's my analysis of it. That's my, I feel like almost complete analysis of it, but yeah, I don't know. That's just what's in my head.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I just feel weird about that question for whatever reason. I don't know. Maybe that means I'm uncomfortable. Maybe that means I am. I have some, more significant type of loyalty, even in a hypothetical. But more, I think it more relates to the idea that, that means like my family has to go away.
Yeah.
And I think most people pay more loyalty to those who are near them than these abstract human beings in any other part of the world. Is my inclination, because that's where I went when you asked me that question. I was like, okay, well then I have to kill
everybody you've ever known or cared about.
Yeah, and I was like, I don't know.
You don't know too many other people from other cultures or nations, right?
I know some.
Or you're just not as close to them. That's the bottom line,
yeah,
right?
Well, it's just a familial thing. It's tribal, I guess, in a way.
Yeah.
But
I mean, and you could mix up this scenario too. Imagine that you go to another nation one day and end up falling in love with somebody there, and then you have to choose, right? The stakes are going to change for you.
Sure.
So that's also things to consider. I guess and this might go into the way that our, potentially our minds work differently, because I don't have the same affinity for family or my inner social circles as you do. And I think that has to do with particularly our different lives and upbringings.
Sure.
Because I don't, I love a lot of people in my family, but we don't have the same type of relationship that other people in other families do. Yeah. It's different. So
breaking a lot of hearts right now, man.
Am I?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like nobody knows it. So I don't think I'm breaking any hearts. Or if I am, then you are late to the game. Everybody knows this. So that's something to consider too, that it might just end up being a matter of preference, which is kind of what allows me to think about all the different cultures as opposed to just my own upbringing or my own family.
I think that some of the things that I'm pulling out as the implication from this quote is that if you choose your country over humanity, there's something wrong with you, or like over the globe, right? Or global society. But for me, again, returning to a point of practicality, is that you have to take care of what is most nearest to you. It's more efficient that way. It's more effective that way. And so when Americans focus on taking care of Americans, they can do more concrete things in that space. Whereas like it might not be as effective or efficient to handle someone else's problem in the world if they're not handling it when they should be. They should be taking care of it themselves. But we are moving into a more globalist society. And so and we are becoming more integrated. And so
that has positives too.
Yes, and as we become more integrated, we become, more intertwined with one another, and we start to, you take more of these the more humanistic approach out of practicality, because we actually have the ability to assist one another now in tangible ways.
Right. Yes, you're saying right, and again, that's one way to look at it. You can say that to act that way is to bring about those. It's to fulfill the mission of being a humanist, right? In the end, that's what you're saying, is that by being a patriot, you can actually fulfill those humanist goals.
I would like to think so, but again, it depends on the motives of a nation and what they're doing.
I think we're talking about America. I think we're talking about the United States of America.
Yeah. And for us, we do contribute to the greater world in both positive and negatives. But to do that in a useful way, again, just returning to this old-fashioned idea that you have to have your own house in order first, to be able to do so. But I don't know that you can't act on multiple levels either. I don't know that you just act locally. I think voting is, while it is a local act, it transcends just the local. It is a social act. That's what I'm driving at, is those things that you do nearest to you bleed out farther,
right,
and farther. And so, but your influence and your power is close to your chest, and you lose the influence and power the farther you get away.
Yeah. And it's also, because we were talking about taking care of what's here, right? But we have been put into instances, and there's legitimate reasons to consider the opposite. So, for instance, would you give up X amount of jobs in order to reduce the price of goods for your nation as a whole, right? And your answer might depend on how many jobs we're talking about here, right? But the reality is, and this is just speaking in terms of economics or economists, they do believe that global trade helps nations more than it hurts them. It actually ends up helping the global economy, which ends up helping each individual nation as a whole. That's just the economist perspective is on that.
You have to determine what your values are and what you want.
Right.
So one decision is going to increase one type of value over another. And with the example that you used, our policies in the United States aren't necessarily making things better for people in other parts of the world. Like if we're losing jobs so that we can have cheaper products, which means people in a different part of the world get that job, that doesn't necessarily improve their life. It might improve the shareholders' lives,
right?
And people who retain those profits, but it might not necessarily be benefiting the common person. So the idea that this is benefiting humanity as a whole across the globe, it might actually be counterintuitive to that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that I still think they're probably going to strongly argue that it's impossible for something to help the global economy, or it not at some level manifest for the everyday person, because it's the global economy. So that's not to say that you don't. Again, there's still a weighing, right? There's still cost, and you have to think about that cost. I'm just also, by the way, just discussing what economists say here. So this isn't what I think. This is just what I've noticed on the IGN boards for Chicago. That's like a pretty good website. I don't know if you've ever been to it, but
Chicago?
It's IGN Chicago. It's kind of like a huge database of economists that there's a poll every so often, and they all vote on it.
That sounds pretty good.
A lot of economists ends up saying this is what we think here. Yeah, so it's interesting to get their perspective on it. But the other argument that I've heard here is that, and keeping in mind, we still want to have this conversation about humanism versus patriotism, but they're going to say that there are other things doing way more harm to the U.S., to nations, whatever you want to call it, than global trade. And that global trade, the benefits of global trade. So I think what they think is happening, this is what I think. I'm not 100% sure, but if I had to take a stab here, I think that what they would say was happening was that we are confusing the deficits in America, the loss of jobs, so on and so forth. We're blaming that on globalism, and so we don't want to engage in globalist actions, when the reality is that it's actually from things like automation and other things, which do, I think, somewhere from 7 to 10 times the amount. They take away 7 to 10 times the amount of jobs as a nation going into the global trade market, or allowing for more global trade does. And I think that's a really good point too. And I think that's something to consider as well. And I think that then again, that brings us back to the point of, in that instance, should we support the global solution as opposed to the national solution?
It depends on,
and it might not be a straightforward
answer. It depends on the issue. I mean, so there are some issues.
Just in that one issue. I'm just talking about just in that one issue of global trade.
I don't know anything about economics, so I can't say it. But, like an easier example for me would be to move over to like climate change and be like, okay, this makes sense to handle
true too
at a global level, and this is where,
even if we incur a certain amount of cost as a nation.
Yes, because we are going to suffer as a nation, as a people, if we don't contribute to handling this problem with the rest of the world. It's going to severely impact not only our generation at this point, but everyone
and our nation. It's going to affect our nation. So
and so like when we return back to this quote and you see these things about like, well, okay, well, I'm a humanist before an American. This is where that idea makes most sense to me, because we know that this is danger. This thing that is happening to our planet that we are driving as human beings is dangerous to all of us, and this takes collaboration at a global level.
Yeah. So sometimes it can work either way. It just depends.
Yeah, it
right?
depends on the issue, I think.
Yeah.
So it just makes sense to handle certain things at different levels.
Yeah. And that's where I saw that quote. That's where I could have put that quote. Again, I'm not going to speak on behalf of that person because I don't know. I see your point that there are implications that imply that potentially people are too patriotic or they should be less patriotic, I think is what you felt like you were getting from it.
If your patriotism diminishes your capacity to do the right thing, even at a national level, your patriotism could be detrimental. If your ideas about what being patriot, like one of the implications of patriotism is loyalty, and so if you consider yourself like a common theme in the United States, I mean, we're talking about our own country here. Republicans feel that they have the brand on patriotism, that they're the true patriots of the country, the true loyalists to the United States. They've branded that very well. Now, if your patriotism causes you to pay loyalty to a party,
that's different.
If your party is doing something negligent to the country, per se, if we're not acknowledging something like climate change, and your patriotism gets in the way of that, because if you were to shift party lines, then that kind of patriotism is a problem. That kind of loyalty is a problem. If you can't step outside what you pay loyalty to, and you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I think it all breaks down to again, when I kind of showed you this quote and I said we can engage with this critically, right? I think that's what we've just done in terms of not looking at it kind of like straightforward, but seeing that it's multifaceted and layered, right? Yeah. And there's not necessarily straightforward answers, but I feel like we made progress. And just to kind of go back to the economic aspects of this real quick, because I think I have a couple more things to say about it. I just think it's interesting because so I used to not like the idea of global trade. I thought that that would be bad for America, right? Mm-hmm. So and this is where I was probably just recently, probably just like a year ago, I was in this mindset. When Bernie Sanders talked about getting us out of NAFTA, right? Wasn't that part of his platform, I think? Mm. And what's the other one? NAFTA.
Sherrod Brown is another politician that's on the Democratic side that's not convinced that
NAFTA is a good thing.
I'm not sure about NAFTA, but I think he is.
And NATO's the other one, right? NAFTA and NATO are kind of like two of the bigger foreign trade.
Well, NATO
is
more geared towards. My understanding of NATO is more geared towards protecting, the nation's a part of it.
Okay.
But I really don't know.
Okay.
So, but particularly NAFTA, yeah.
North American Free Trade Organization or Association. What is it? Agreement. North American Free Trade Agreement. And then what does NATO stand for? North American. Oh shit, Jay. I gotta look it up. Give me a second. That's what NAFTA stands for. NAFTA stands for North American Free Trade Agreement. Let's see. I just want to make sure I got this right real quick. NATO. Let's see. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Yeah, and I knew that was different. That has more to do with like the military and stuff. But it is NAFTA. NAFTA for sure. I thought that there was another one, but maybe not. But North American Free Trade Agreement, yes. And so I think we are mostly talking about NAFTA here. And I was of the mindset that it was a bad thing, and then I still don't know if it's a good or bad thing. I don't know, but I do distinctly remember thinking it's a bad thing, and now I'm in the position where I don't know, because economists seem to say, no, global trade is what you want. It helps you in the long run. You might take initial losses, but you're going to gain that back pretty quickly once the world economy improves.
Yeah.
I think
Again,
is the idea.
there's trade-offs to things. So like one of the benefits about global trade, like particularly with the relationship between us and China, right, is when you're so intertwined economically, that gives you incentive to not go to war with one another or challenge each other in such a catastrophic way.
Yep, that's a good point.
The inverse of that is if you are too reliant on global trade and relationships change in the future, you may be in a position where you could be significantly hindered if someone cuts off your supply to a certain thing that you need.
Yeah.
So part of that may be beneficial to be self-sufficient as a country and be able to produce your own products in-house,
Yeah.
So there's trade-offs to those things.
Well, I think that's interesting because that goes into that, we don't have to spend too much time talking about all this, but it goes into that article that I had just sent you recently about, I don't think this is completely irrelevant. You can tell me if you feel like it is. But the sharing profits and ownership with workers not only makes them happier, it benefits the bottom line too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think kind of I don't want to mess up this relationship too bad. Maybe they are too unrelated for this to be talked about now. But in terms of economy, it actually helps to get more people involved, I think, is the bottom line. I think that's the connection. What this article is saying here is an article in The Conversation, essentially by several people, it looks like. Joseph Blasi, Douglas L. Cruz, and Maureen Conway. By the way, everything that I'm saying about economy right now, or the things that we're talking about, I'm interested to know what an economist's interpretation of what I said would be, because I'm not sure. I'm not saying that's what economists believe. What I'm saying is that's my interpretation of what economists believe, and I am interested in knowing what economists believe. So if you are an economist and you're listening to this, don't feel like, I'm not saying I'm an expert on this and I know what's what. What I'm saying is this is how I perceive it, and if you know something different, obviously tell me what you think, because I want to know how, what the accurate way to look at these things is. But so going from there, this seems intuitive to me, and it's the same thing like we were talking about with NAFTA. Yes, there's a trade-off. And you're also bringing up some pretty good points in terms of like warfare, and it changes your relationship with other nations in ways that you have to think about critically and consider, right? Which is also something that you want to say and put out there, right? Is okay, maybe let's suppose that globalist trade or globalizing things is better for us in some instances, right? Let's say that, but let's still think critically about it. Okay, or what we might say is it seems this way, right? So given certain studies or theories in economy, if you want to call them that, but that is not an excuse to not think about the actual implications of any one globalist action, and to think about whether or not the pros outweigh the cons, essentially, and to try your best to be unbiased about that question. Because you might have an inclination, well, I am more patriotic or nationalist, so I want the answer to be that deglobalizing is what's best, or I hate this idea of nationalism and patriotism, so I want globalism to be what's best, right? To really avoid those mindsets and just kind of allow the data to speak and represent itself. I feel like it's pretty fair and straightforward, and cuts to exactly what that quote was saying, and I really feel like we chopped this thing up. We've been chopping this thing up pretty finely so far. So
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to, and basically what you want to do is inject, and I think maybe this is what he's trying to get at in the quote, is inject those humanistic principles into patriotism, because you don't want blind patriotism. You don't want that kind of patriotism that a perfect example of dangerous patriotism is like, the ethno nationalistic ideologies of Nazi Germany, right? That kind of patriotism where the population is caught up in that idea is dangerous. I mean, so if you have a population that is patriotic, and if the United States has a population of individuals with humanistic principles, they may see it as their patriotic duty to do good in the world, or to do good in their country within its boundaries. And that's the kind of patriotism that you want.
Right.
And to diverge from a popular sentiment among the population doesn't make you less patriotic if the intentions are good and there's evidence to back up what your ideas are going to do in the world would be better for the country and the world.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Divergence is not a bad thing if the intentions are positive.
Right, for sure.
But there's this feeling of like, I cannot diverge from what my group thinks.
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, going back to the Republican branding of patriotism.
Yeah.
Divergence from that is almost like, okay, you're excommunicated. Like, we can't trust you at this point anymore.
Yeah, and that actually goes into my conversation a little bit about, which I've had before. I'll stop making snap, like, fucking, like those noises. That happens every once in a while because I get parched. So I need to drink more water. But, so I'm sorry if that's been annoying the shit out of you so far. I'll try not to do that again. But, yeah, I think, that those are all good points, and that well, let me go to something I was thinking of before real quick, because I can't remember the other thing. So one is to throw in the idea of evolutionary, kind of looking at it through evolution, in terms of, well, humans developed before nations developed, and you actually couldn't have nations without humans, but you could have humans without nations, right? So to look at it from that perspective and say, like, fundamentally what keeps us around is the fact that we are a unified species. Without the species, we wouldn't be. The species is the thing to maintain, right? But maybe you think your nation is the way to maintain that species, which is what we were talking about earlier, right?
Yes.
And you're not sure. But that is one way of looking at it and saying maybe humanism could be favored over patriotism because you don't have the nation without human. I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but I'm saying that's the way to look at it, essentially. And then what was the other thing I was going to say? I was going to say something because you were talking about how... divergence, right? The fact that this goes into my conversation about kind of avoiding labels, or not avoiding labels, but not concerning myself with the labels, right? Or like, I'm not going to concern myself how people want to categorize me. Feel free to do it in any way that I hope associates me to you if you are a genuinely truthful and moral human being. If you see yourself as a truthful and moral human being, and you want to ascribe me to your group because you feel like there are components of what I say that fit into it, fine. Go ahead. I'm more concerned in the conversation and the nuance of arguments and not necessarily the categories. But that being said, you've also pointed out you don't want people to just label you whatever, right? Because you might get labeled some pretty bad stuff. Right, Nazis probably think they're truthful and moral. Do I want them to be like, oh, well, then you're a Nazi? Well, no, I'm not a Nazi, right? Yeah. So there's still limits to it, right? And the idea that I am an American. I live in America. I almost can't avoid it. And I don't think you should. I don't think you should avoid that fact, There are people who try, and I understand where they come from, so I won't say like you shouldn't do that. But I don't do that. I don't try to avoid the fact that I was born in United States of America, and that's part of who I am. And there's literally no way around it. There is literally no way to get around that fact.
Can I tell a story? Sorry,
Go ahead. I feel that pretty much covered what I said.
Let me tell a story about. I don't want to say their name or anything, but I have a friend from Bolivia, and I think this is a good example of patriotism. I think this is one of the like at an individual level. This is good. So this is someone that I met when I was traveling in South America, who I've seen over the course of the year since I left there. I consider them a good friend, although I don't talk to them a lot. And well-educated individual, has worked and traveled throughout the United States, and does have the ability to like basically get a job here and live here if they wanted to, and stay and eventually become a citizen. And we were talking about where he would want to live and stuff, and he was mentioning as much as he would like to live in the United States, he feels it would be wrong of him to leave Bolivia and not stay there and make that like his home a better place for his generation and future generations.
Yeah.
That kind of patriotism, that to me is patriotic. You're saying, okay, this is where I'm from. The decision to where I'm going to live is going to drastically alter the path of my life, but I choose to remain where I grew up and use the knowledge that I've garnered throughout my life to make this place better. That's the kind of patriotism that I admire, and that comes from humanistic ideas,
right? But we can also still recognize, I think, that works in certain contexts. That doesn't work in all contexts. That is patriotism is even, and you can look at it the same way that I look at morality. That you should feel fortunate to be a person who can be patriotic, because some people can't afford that. So, for instance, do you want to be a patriotic North Korean? A lot of them are patriotic, right? But do you want them to fix the issues from the inside, or do you want them to get out if they have the opportunity?
I mean, I think the ideal situation.
Just to layer this just a little bit. This goes into Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson's conversation. I don't remember if you remember that part, where Jordan Peterson's talking about acting at local levels and the family and acting on behalf. I forget exactly how he puts it, but Slavoj, I think he had a really good point here when he said like, that's easy to say in certain contexts, but we're certainly not going to say such a thing to a North Korean. I think that's kind of the point that he made, and I should probably actually look it up to get it verbatim how he put it, because Jordan Peterson said something very specific, so I don't want to. I'll probably look that up while you're giving your piece, but I think that layers kind of the cake a little bit more.
Well, again, okay, so when you mentioned patriotism in North Korea, I thought the route that you were going to go was, again, I don't think anyone owes loyalty to the North Korean government. That's not the kind of patriotism that I think I'm looking for. And you also
because you also said like not to the point where you can't, what was it? Diverge.
Yeah.
Right.
Again, with the divergence, that's an American problem with paying loyalty to certain parties and the implications of you being patriotic or unpatriotic in conjunction with those. But with North Korea, like we've seen, again, okay, going to Iraq, to use North Korea as an example, when the people are not invested in someone changing their government, things go wrong. So the North Korean people have to be the ones that say this needs to change.
But that's not. But I have to say, I don't think that's practical. I think we can have a critical conversation at this point, because I think that, like, would you do that?
Again, the closer would I what?
I feel like it's one of those things that's easier. So this is what I found the quote, by the way.
The North Koreans and South Koreans, as things stand now, people are still alive that have family members in North Korea, right? So if South Korea liberated North Korea, that would make sense, because there's familial connection to that, right? And there's something,
Right, but you wouldn't want someone in North Korea to maintain that nation state for because that would be patriotic in the sense that we talk about it, right? We're trying to preserve the America and its traditions in some way.
yeah. So North Korean students are brought up to be patriotic to the government,
Right, but do we want them to?
No.
Right. So my point is that then that patriotism only works in certain contexts. That's not.
And I think, I guess in my mind, I thought I addressed that.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I totally agree. Your patriotism is dependent on, the right and wrong of things.
Right.
So you don't want blind patriotism.
Right. Yeah, and I think that goes back to the whole, like, they're not mutually exclusive in necessarily every circumstance. Sometimes doing the patriotic thing is innately humanist.
Mm-hmm.
So I do want to just throw this in here because I found it. Jordan Peterson was talking about getting your house in order, right? And again, you can, because I got the impression that Slavoj and Peterson left on pretty good terms. From there were a bunch of comments afterwards about the fact that they're friends now or whatever. I think they like each other now, or whatever it is.
To me, it became less of a debate and more Jordan Peterson was just curious about what Slavoj thought when I watched it.
Yeah. I got a back and forth. I thought that Zizek, because and this is a good point. Peterson's talking about setting your house in order, right?
Yeah.
And Zizek's point is fair enough. I'm pretty sure that's one of the first things that he says, right? It's like, fair enough, but let's not have this talk of getting your house in order to a North Korean, right? Like, it's easy to say when you're in a nation that makes that easier, and it's actually beneficial for you to stabilize yourself and work with what's around you rather than remove yourself and uproot yourself and move your family, right? Which is unstable. It's an unstable thing to do, even though you are doing it in hopes that you can stabilize somewhere else, right? But it's predicated, and this is where I also wanted to have now that I'm thinking about it, where I also want to have this conversation with you, because when you were talking about the individual, the family, the community, so on and so forth, right? Like acting in kind of that pattern, right? And one of the things that stuck out to me about that is, of course, all the positives that we've already talked about in regards to it, but also the confusion of the individual and family and community all being different from nationalism or patriotism, right? That those are still different actions as well. And what are the distinctions there? And, do you want to tell us? I think we would be in agreement here, and probably most people would, that you should act at the individual level. And like, how do you not act at the individual level? And then you should act at the filial level, right? And how do you really not act at the filial level? And then the community, right? But I think the further that you get out, to me, patriotism and nationalism is a more macro than individual or family. It's more macro. It might even be close, and I'm not going to say this definitively. But it's something to think about. It might even be the case that nationalism is closer to globalism than nationalism is closer to globalism than it is to individualism or filial actions.
Nationalism is closer to globalism than it is
in terms of impact, in terms of its closeness to us as individuals.
Yeah,
that we might actually be that nationalism might be closer to globalism than individualism is to nationalism, to activism.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
See what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. So, because I think that's
interesting.
The further that you go out too, the more you can say you need to be more critical. Not that you need to disregard, right? So like, if you're acting at an individual level, it's hard not to do that. If you're acting at a family level, it's hard not to do that. Once you start to get to community, you start to have some contradictions between community and family.
Yeah, there's a little bit of loss of identity, but it's still
and you
close.
have to start to think critically about community.
Yeah, and it also depends on the community. Like, how diverse is your community? Like, is it homogenous? Is it not? Is everyone the same race, the same religion? So it's going to be harder in a place like New York City to feel close as a community. Maybe I could be wrong. Than it would be in like a little teeny tiny town of a population of 500, where everybody basically thinks the same,
and those
the same
incentives change too, right?
Yeah.
The second that we're talking about New York City as opposed to, let's say, I don't know if Jay wants me to say this.
Just make up a different town.
I'm trying.
How about
Gainesville,
Johnsontown?
Well, okay, fine. I was looking for like a
population
real
500 in the middle. The nearest town to Johnsontown is an hour and a half away.
Like, I don't know. I feel like Gainesville wouldn't be.
Are you talking about Florida?
Yeah, that wouldn't be an accurate representation.
Nope.
But there's got to be one. What's a good one, Jay? Give me one. That won't reveal too much.
How about a place like Stanley, Idaho?
Okay. All right. So Stanley,
Idaho,
Idaho,
teeny
right?
tiny mountain town.
So the incentives of how you would suggest someone behave are going to change from New York to Stanley, Idaho.
Yeah.
Right. You would want someone to act more integral with their community, whereas in New York, possibly things are so disparate there that you would say, actually, you need to do what's against the community in these circumstances and really just pay attention to your family and the local unit, and then so on and so forth, you know, kind of with everything. So yeah, I feel like that's what I've been meaning to say for a while now. I feel like that's what we were tiptoeing around the last episode, that I really couldn't articulate, and maybe you couldn't articulate some things, but
I struggle to articulate many things.
Yeah, it's not easy.
And I think that shows up in the podcast a lot. But even at the individual level, I mean, I think, for me, if I had a family, it would be my responsibility to inject appropriate kinds of patriotism in my kids. Because for me, growing up, I did have blind patriotism as growing up. So my perception...
I think we both did to some degree as well.
Returning back to the idea of this American myth was I bought 100% into the idea that the United States is always doing the right thing in the world. And so when with the question of should we go to war to Iraq wasn't a question in my mind, because that's what our government was pushing for, and I was like, they must be doing it for the right reasons. Yeah. And I didn't think anything beyond that.
Do you feel like your humanism is what superseded that? Like, your humanism was the answer to that question. Like, what made the Iraq war wrong? Is your answer to that humanism? I mean, or because of the missing humanism element
aspect of it, and the morality of that.
No, it'll come back on.
Is why I changed my mind. Okay, yeah, technical difficulties, but the moral aspects of it didn't make sense with my understanding of my country. It didn't match, is what I'm saying. Yeah. And so that's what brought about those questions. And so that's when I realized that just my assumption about the way our country behaves, my patriotism, started to shift a bit. I don't feel like I'm less patriotic than I used to be. I feel like I'm just as patriotic as when I was younger, 17, 18. But the way I respond through that patriotism is different now. Now I try to be more critical about because I think you can. The distinction was I don't think that you could be critical of your people and the place that you come from if you're a patriot, is what I thought back then. Right. Whereas now I think it is your patriotic duty. And it's the flip of the coin.
And sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off too much, but because I think this is important too, that you can even add to that it might be a component of your society and your culture to be critical. Yeah. And I think it is. I don't think we're critical of our nation because we got this funky idea in our brain. I think it's because people who were great thinkers from our culture themselves said, this is what you should do.
Here's the extension of that, though. And I think
I feel like there's a quote here too. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. In the extension of this, and one of the problems of this is when your critical patriotism becomes this inner hatred towards your homeland. Yeah. Which is what I see on the left a lot, is now this actual disgust or hatred for our country. And that's when that's the kind of like I don't know if it's anti-patriotism, but you think that we've done so much wrong in the world now that
You just dismiss everything that we've
yes.
done positively
yeah,
or our intentions, right?
You just throw patriotism out, like
Right.
totally. That's the problem
Yeah.
I have as an individual.
Yeah, it gets pretty crazy. It gets pretty crazy in terms of like there's people speaking out against science or scientific facts in some instances, and it's just like you've taken it too far.
Yeah,
like
I guess it's a framing issue for me, how you frame things.
Throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's a bunch of terms to go, but
yeah, it's a framing issue. So you can, like, I view like the way I frame my patriotism is to think critically, but to not interject some kind of because I mean, just the fact of the matter is where I come from, my country and my community is part of my identity, and so to hate those things is like a weird way of like hating yourself. Yeah. And I think that's inappropriate and not good.
I think maybe some people are trying to so I think what happens is they see all the negative things that the nation has done or the culture has done. You can talk about, you're going to have to, you can't have a conversation of nationalism or patriotism too long without bringing up imperialism and British imperialism. You're not, those are going to be concomitant in some way. So I think that oh shit, I lost it.
Between nationalism and imperialism.
Yeah, between
are you saying that are you worried that nationalistic perspective may
no, I remember now. Okay, so I think that you see those things, or you see all those aspects of it. You see, slavery, you see again imperialism, and you say, I'm a part of this culture that has been prideful and dominant and hurt a lot of people. So and possibly knee-jerk, but whatever it is, my response is going to be to humble myself by degrading myself. And I don't think that you have to degrade yourself to humble yourself.
Totally agree.
Yeah, I think that's probably where we're going to see. That's to me where I feel like the problem is when you speak to somebody on the left who believes that or feels that way. It's like you can get to where you want to get and fix the issues that you see without taking it to where you've taken it. Where you've taken it.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And I feel like that happens.
Yep, that makes perfect sense to me.
So I'm going to, because there's some quotes here. There's one. I can swear there's a quote out there somewhere that has something to do with like basically the sentiment is that the patriotic thing to do is to criticize and question your country or your government and your nation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we get that from our founding fathers. I mean, that's exactly what they did.
Well, they literally wrote, while all this was going on, the idea is like if the government becomes too tyrannical, you should overthrow it.
Yeah.
That's not, you can look at that and say, well, that doesn't sound patriotic, right? But they would probably argue, no, that's what patriotism is.
That's exactly what they did.
That's to fix the house, right? That's to fix the disrupted house.
Yeah.
Right. So, but some close quotes to that. This is Mark Twain: loyalty to country always, and always is on all caps. Loyalty to government when it deserves it. And so that's also something that you can incorporate to that. It's like,
yeah. Okay. So that's important. If we have to be explicit, we are I would separate government from country, just like that was Mark Twain, right?
Yeah.
That makes total sense to me. I don't owe my loyalty to an institution. I owe it to my country, which I consider my home, and it just happens to be divided by certain boundaries that lets me know what home is.
Yeah. A couple other things, two other ones I'm going to share. I think this one probably captures what I was getting at earlier. There is no flag large enough to cover the shame of killing innocent people. So that's by Howard Zinn. That's just something to think about. I'm not advocating for it or taking it away, but it is about the nation. It goes into humanism versus patriotism, things to think about, because we certainly do kill innocent people, and I don't know if it's avoidable, right? So, but it's something
not
to think
if you
about.
Want to maintain power.
Yeah. Another one, and this is by Theodore Roosevelt. Patriotism means to stand by the country. It does not mean to stand by the president or any other public official, save exactly to the degree in which he himself stands by the country. It is patriotic to support him insofar as he efficiently serves the country. It is unpatriotic not to oppose him to the exact extent that by inefficiency or otherwise he fails in his duty to stand by the country. In either event, it is unpatriotic not to tell the truth, whether about the president or anyone else.
And this is the failing of the Republican Party currently, is because their idea of patriotism is loyalty. Is loyalty to the party, not loyalty to what needs to be
the country.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is something that I think is going to affect them for a long time after the Trump presidency. I could be wrong, but again, the inverse of that is that people who were once Republicans or are Republicans don't feel comfortable going to the Democratic side because they feel that there's just this self-loathing hatred for this thing that they love, which is their country. So there's nowhere for them to go, so they just stay where they are.
Yep, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's pretty good sum up of all of that. So, yeah. Well, let's see. We fucked up liberals. We fucked up Republicans. So who else?
So we're good.
Who else? No, that's good.
The
that's
anarchists.
Great.
I mean, we could go after the anarchists because, again, the idea about nations and communities. It's really about organization, and that the ability to organize allows you to do certain things that you wouldn't do if you weren't organized.
I feel like some anarchists are flipping us off right now.
That's fine.
Oh, because you might have anarchists that think that, but I do know anarchists that would say that we don't understand anarchy. They would say that anarchy can have order. I don't know how. I have no clue how, but I have seen people represent that, and I just didn't care, so I didn't look into it too much. But that's something to consider. I feel like, is that what you were saying?
To find a place in the world to watch that play out.
Yeah.
If we could just cut out a 700-mile square footage area.
Yeah.
And just let them go for it.
Yeah.
And
do your thing.
Yeah. I think immediately it's just going to become a power struggle like everything else is.
Right.
But I don't know. I feel good where we're at. Do you want to?
No, I think that's a pretty decent bow. So
cool. Yeah, I'll read the quote again real quick just so people can hear it one more time and look it up.
And don't forget all that other stuff, subscribe. We said we'd start saying this at the beginning of the podcast. We keep forgetting, but subscribe. Again, it's the currency of discourse, which is, it's conversation. It's about multiple people conversing. So reaching out. If you don't like the video, then downvote the video. That is a response. If you don't know that is a response. That lets us know something, right? So please, you might not like what we say, but please give us the courtesy of engaging with us.
We haven't even gotten a downvote or a like.
I know.
At this
yeah.
point. So,
we've gotten likes. We totally got. Yeah, we've totally got likes.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, because if we got a downvote, I'd be like, sweet, someone saw it.
Yeah. No, we've gotten some likes. You should go check it out. We've gotten some views too. It's just not that much. So.
Yeah. Well, okay, so here's the quote again before we go, and it's, I consider myself to be a human being first and an American second. As such, I place humanity over country, and if that makes me less patriotic, it makes patriots less human. So that's what we were trying to break apart or figure out in this podcast, but we appreciate y'all taking the time to listen. Please reach out to us like Quade was saying.
We'll be up on several platforms soon. We're trying to
hopefully.
Branch out. So we should have, I'm hoping to make a website here soon so you can kind of just have access to as many of those platforms or formats as possible. So things to look forward to.
Cool. All right. Well, we appreciate you listening. This is Currency of Discourse. This is the Currency of Discourse podcast. And have a good night.
Have a nice night, guys.